As someone with a global audience, I get asked all the time about global remote jobs. And while they sound great in theory, there are a lot of things that I think need to be talked about before you decide whether or not that's something you want to even pursue. I'm not saying they're all bad, but they have a lot of downsides that could potentially come up depending on the company. As someone who's actually worked remotely at international companies before, there were a lot of things I noticed that I never would have thought to look for in the past. So one thing that could actually be an issue if you ever wanted to pursue something like this is language barriers. Language barriers, a lot of times when you work at an international company, language barriers are fine that you will usually have, say, English as your company's main language, and you'll do all your meetings and everything in English. But the problem is, English is not the first language for many of your coworkers. So they may take something differently than you actually meant it. Or some of their messages, even if you use something like Slack, many of the messages may not make total sense to you and you might have to constantly clarify. You may have to have your meetings run longer than need be because you have to keep asking them to repeat themselves. It really just depends on the coworker, where they're located, and their language skills. It may not seem like a big deal, but once your meetings start going longer than usual and you're constantly having to clarify things all the time with each other, it can lead to you possibly working some later hours past your normal schedule. Number 2, cultural misalignment is something that I never would have considered before working at these types of companies, but cultural misalignment is something that probably doesn't come up that much. You may not have heard of this type of term before, but actually, let's just say you grew up in America. So if you're an American born and raised, you are used to a certain type of culture. Well, you could have coworkers in the whole other side of the world in, say, China or in India or something like that, and they grew up with a totally different culture. They were born and raised in a totally different part of the world where the norm is completely different there from the norm in America or wherever you grew up. Now, the reason this can make work difficult is in some jobs, it requires a certain amount of creativity. So, for instance, if you work in marketing, what works in America may not work in an Asian country or a South American country. Some things might be offensive to one culture, some things might be funny to another culture. Some things might be edgy to one culture. Some things might get a lot of clicks with another culture. That's just one example, but these things, you need to consider the type of job you have and how working with an international company where maybe you have a supervisor that works in another country and is born and raised there could impact your job and how difficult it is for you to actually get things done and for you to be on the same page. Time zones are kind of obvious, but time zones can be an issue as well. Some international companies literally have people working in the middle of the night in one country and in the typical 9 to 5 in another country. Depending on the headquarters of the company, or if they have multiple main headquarters locations, this can really throw people off. You might have someone who's working at 2 a.m. somewhere who's sleepy and having to constantly drink coffee to stay awake, and then you have somebody else who's working in the middle of the day and feels fresh and has lots of energy. Well, this can lead to mood swings. This can lead to someone maybe not staying on top of their work as much as they should, and could create bottlenecks and hurt your deadlines. So you might want to clarify before you apply at an international company, you might want to clarify how the time zones work, who your supervisor is going to be, who your coworkers are going to be, where are they working, and what are the hours of your main coworkers. Because a lot of times you have to have overlap for your actual Zoom meetings. Another thing is the pay difference. This seems obvious, but a lot of times when you apply at an international company, it sounds great. A lot of them offer really cool benefits. But one downside there is, why do they hire internationally? Well, one reason a lot of companies hire internationally is they know that they can save money on salaries by hiring people that live in a country that has a lower cost of living. So if you hire somebody in America, they have a high cost of living just on average. If you hire somebody in a totally different country, a third world country, for instance, they might not have to have nearly as much to survive. So in that way, you might not be able to get the pay range that you expect or would normally get in your country just because they know they can hire other people on the same team at a fraction of the cost. It can also lead to it being difficult to get raises or difficult to get promotions that really matter. Working at an international company can also give you some tax and legal issues that you normally wouldn't have to deal with. Depending on the headquarters of the company and where your pay is actually coming from, it can be a huge headache. This could literally lead to double taxation, social security issues, labor law issues. It may be difficult for you to get unemployment if you were to get laid off. It really just depends on the company's headquarters and where you're getting paid from, where you're located, and how the company operates. Either way, do your research on how the headquarters of the company would impact your taxes, what would happen if you were to get laid off, and how that would impact things like Social Security, how you pay your taxes, etc. Another problem with international jobs is there can be a lot more competition. A lot of people want to work remotely because it's obviously way better. But when it comes to applying for remote jobs, it's usually more competitive than it is for a local job because you don't have to worry about commuting, so it opens up the talent pool to a lot more people, which means you are competing against the best of the best to get a remote job in many cases, unless the remote job kind of goes under the radar. Well, it gets even worse if you're applying for a remote job that is also international. You are competing against the best of the best of the people that see the job listing from not only your country, but also many other countries as well. So if you want to lower your competition, it actually is better to find, if you want to work remotely, remote job boards that maybe have some that go by the state or by the territory that you live in or by country, as opposed to going fully international. This also goes hand in hand with the next problem that could arise, which is ATS systems and things like that. So as you probably know by now, applying for a job is very difficult these days because now we have all these ATS systems that automatically filter jobs. We also have rising unemployment, which is leading to hundreds or maybe even thousands of applicants per job, depending on the job. This means there are more applicants, there's more data, and therefore these companies are having to set automated systems to auto-reject certain things that they see in your resume. So if you are applying for an international job, a lot of times there may be more filters because there's more competition, there's more applicants, there's more data to filter through. So they can be more picky about who they are willing to interview, and therefore they may set certain parameters in place to automatically reject a lot of resumes that don't have something in them, like say a college degree, or don't have a certain amount of years of experience. In other words, if you're applying for international remote jobs, it's probably even more important for you to optimize your application for each individual job listing instead of just using the same resume for all applications. Another issue is intellectual property anxiety. And I mean anxiety on behalf of the companies. Many US companies, for example, are hesitant to give international employees their most sensitive and high-level data. It's because these types of employees in other countries, depending on the country, could actually get away with data theft, and it would be almost impossible for the US company to sue them if they are across certain borders. So if it's say, just for this example, a US company that has a global workforce, they might hire a lot of people internationally for grunt work related jobs, but those people in those roles may have a really hard time getting promotions because they're not allowed to access higher level information that's private to the company. Now, I'm not totally against international remote jobs. Again, I've had some in the past and they have their pros as well as their cons, but it's just some things to consider for your situation. Some of these might matter more than others, but a lot of times it's better to not have to learn these things the hard way.